interpreters. Now, let's begin. This is the first of the Housing Insight sessions, so welcome all to kind of our pilot session today. It's part of the World Habitat Network, which is a network for all the winners of the World Habitat Award. You can imagine it is a pretty expansive network, given that the awards have been running since 1986. These are public sessions where awardees primarily present their solutions to a wider audience. And I think the reason we've introduced this is it's an opportunity for us all to learn about practical, workable ideas. We will be holding many of these sessions as well in the future, so I encourage you to look to our LinkedIn, newsletter, social media to hear about future events. Now, today's session is one I'm very, very excited about. It's called Legal Tools for Housing Rights. And the question at its heart is a practical one. How do communities and small organizations use the law to make housing rights real and to make them last? Under international law, to be adequately housed means having secure tenure, not having to worry about being evicted, having your home or your land taken away. And it also means living somewhere with access to services like water and sanitation, and within reach of schools, healthcare, and employment. And it also means living somewhere that respects your culture. So we have 3 projects with us today, each of which have found a different legal route to reach that very goal. What I find very striking about this group, I think, is the range. We have a negotiated contract, we have a collective land title, a national act of parliament, but all of them have this same underlying logic that secure housing depends on legal protection and that community groups and NGOs are more than capable of achieving that. So right now I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we can kind of get started and ask questions. So first off, I would like to introduce our panelist from Jakarta. He is representing the Urban Poor Consortium, which worked with communities who have been evicted from their homes in coastal areas and in areas of high land value. So through negotiated contract agreements, they secured the rights of those communities to not only return to their land, but also to return to buildings that were adapted to their needs. So Gugun Muhammad is here today joining us. He's an activist and a community organizer with the Urban Poor Consortium. And he's also a community leader in one of those affected communities that were at risk of eviction. So that's also really interesting to get to hear his insight on that. In San Juan, Puerto Rico, the Caño Martin Peña Community Land Trust has also done something very remarkable. It secured collective land title for thousands of families in informal settlements along the Martin Peña Channel, permanently removing that land from the speculative market. Now, the Community Land Trust, which I believe is the first of its kind in Latin America and the Caribbean, emerged from a really extensive process of community participation, which is something that you're going to see with all 3 of these projects. Yes, it is legal tools, but it's also the idea that the community has been involved and is part of considering these as lasting and sustainable tools. So speaking about that project, we have Mariolga Julia Pacheco, who is the director of the Office of Participation, Citizenship and Social Development, and has been part of this work for many years. Our final awardee, and also most recent awardee, actually, they were awarded the Gold Award this year, and it is for the Platform for Social Housing in Czechia, which has helped shape the new Social Housing Act. And that act is a really landmark legislation that really shifted the country's response to homelessness from that of crisis management to prevention. So with us today, we have David Veluch, who is a counselor for ending homelessness at the Platform. And he has worked in the social sphere since 1996 with over 15 years experience in psychotherapy, drug addiction, and social housing projects. So we're very happy to have him here with us today. The final panelist is not necessarily a World Habitat awardee, but I would definitely consider her a World Habitat ally. Joining our 3 project representatives is Julieta Perucca, the co-founder of The Shift, and she brings over a decade of experience as a human rights advocate, specializing in housing. As a senior aide to the UN Special Rapporteur, she conducted site visits across the world and advised national and local governments on housing rights. And she now leads groundbreaking work on climate change and housing and works with municipalities on really embedding policy solutions. So she's here today to bring kind of a wider framework to this conversation and to push us on what these local and national tools look like from an international human rights perspective. So across these very different contexts, we will be asking what makes legal frameworks durable, transferable, and genuinely protective, and what it takes to move from declaring housing as a human right to actually enforcing it. The format for this panel today is that I'm going to ask a few questions to our panelists, and then I'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A. Please feel free throughout the session. You'll see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and you can add your questions via that tool. If you're having trouble with it, my colleague can also look to the chat to let me know if there are any questions that have come up there. But we really encourage use of that function. And I think with that in mind, I'm probably going to start asking the questions and getting to the interesting content. So my first question is actually to Gugun, and it's a question asking him if he could walk us through the contract that you used to secure rights for the Kampong communities that were evicted. Who are the parties? What does it commit them to? And what form does it take on paper? Please go ahead, Gugun.
All right, thank you, Abby, for the opportunity to share about our experience. My sound is clear, huh?
It is.
All right, so yeah, thanks again. I'd like to share one of our experience from Jakarta. It's about how we use a political contract to help secure housing rights for kampung communities. Kampung, when we say kampung, it's like a favela in Brazil. Before I share about the contract, let me explain also about the context. Between in 2014 till 2016, Jakarta experienced large-scale forced eviction. More than 15,000 families lost their homes. The reason was urban development. At the same time, Jakarta was preparing for the 2017 governor election. And mostly during every election, candidates make many promises. They also give money, small money for sure, and food packages and campaign t-shirt to get people's votes. But after they are elected, many of them become the people who order evictions. At that time, we were resisting eviction for sure, and we were also preparing alternative proposal. And we organized many demonstrations to fight against the eviction. But at the time, we also decided to use the election as another strategy. We wanted to put two issues into the election. First, to stop forced eviction, and second, replace them with the participatory upgrading the same location for kampung. Our idea was simple. A candidate needs people votes to win the election, and people need secure and decent housing. We want to connect these two needs. Communities will give their votes. In return, the candidate will commit to housing policies if they won the election. Instead of waiting until after the election, we wanted to negotiate these commitments before the election. So we started by holding meeting in each kampung. Residents discuss the problem that they face. They discuss the causes of those problems, and they propose the solution. We collected the proposal from all the kampungs. Then we prepared one draft. After that, we invited also legal expert and another practitioners. We discussed the draft together. The practitioner and legal expert also give comments and suggestions. So then we finalized the contract together. One thing was very important for us. We wanted this document to meet the legal requirement of a contract under Indonesian law. In Indonesia, campaign promises are not legally binding. That is why we chose to use a contract. We didn't want it to become only a campaign promise or political declaration. We wanted the commitments to remain valid throughout the governor 5 years term. If the governor failed to carry out the agreement, we wanted the community to have a legal basis to bring the dispute to the court. In this way, the contract also created a clear mechanism for accountability. The contract asks the candidate to commit to at least 5 things. First, to stop forced eviction. Second, to recognize kampung collectively. Next, to change the spatial plan. next to provide a budget for kampung upgrading and to carry out participatory planning. In return, community committed to mobilize foods from the communities that agreed to support the candidate. The contract was signed in public. The media also covered the signing. After that, we campaigned for the candidate. We walked in the communities that signed the agreement. We also campaigned for more widely. We use also social media, and we talk to people directly, person in person, to campaign the candidate. The candidate we support won the election. He became governor of Jakarta 2017 to 2022. After he became governor, we prepared more detailed proposal. We discussed how each commitment could be implemented. I still remember at the time our first meeting with the governor. Dozens of community representatives attended, and also senior government officials were also there. The meeting took place in the same room that had previously been used to decide the evictions. But this time, at that time, the discussion was different. We discussed how to rebuild kampung that had been demolished and how to improve existing kampung. But implementation was not easy. We had many long discussions. Sometimes we disagreed. We also continued organizing demonstration to the city hall. For us, signing the contract was only the beginning. It's like an entry point. We still had to make sure that the government carry out the agreement and carry out in the way that had been agreed. Several important commitments were implemented. For example, Kampung Aquarium and Kampung Kunir were rebuilt on the same sites. The Jakarta government introduced, and second, the Jakarta government introduced a kampung upgrading program. After a long time, Jakarta government didn't have program for kampung. And it covered 445 locations. This was far more than we had originally proposed to the government, to the contract. And also hundreds of kampung were recognized through change to the spatial plan. This because spatial plan is one of the cause of the eviction in Jakarta. Many kampungs declare as a green zone or industrial zone or commercial zone. But now with this regulation, the kampung recognized by the government as a settlement. And also, thousands of homes receive collective building legality. For a long time, they unrecognized the people building. The city also invests in kampung infrastructure, and it supports with the participatory planning. And also, the government support the people to build the housing cooperative in many kampungs in Jakarta. And at the end of the government term, we evaluate the implementation of the political contract. Yeah, some commitments were achieved, but some were not. But overall, the contract helped change Jakarta housing policy from forced eviction to participatory kampung upgrading. So to conclude, for us, the political contract was an experiment. It was an experiment in turning a political moment into a legal instrument. So we used the governor election to create a legal basis for securing housing rights. For the first time, poor communities stood as equals with the candidates and negotiate their demands before the election. The contract was not only a legal instrument, it was also an organizing tool. It helped communities use their votes to negotiate public policies before the election. Instead of using their vote for short-term campaign gift, people use them to pursue a more fundamental and long-term goal, the right to secure and decent housing. That's all. Abby, back to you. Thank you.
I have to say, every time I got the privilege of going to see this project in Jakarta, but every time I hear the story again, it just brings a smile to my face. And I didn't actually know that about the very same room that they had been that the evictions were being decided on was also the place where the community were now being able to have their rights restored. It also raises a very interesting question around zoning and how zoning is used oftentimes to evict communities, what you were talking about with the grey areas as well. But it's always inspiring to hear it. So thank you, Gugun. Now, I'm going to move on to Mariolga, and she also is familiar with communities at risk of eviction and how to mobilize in the face of that. So, Mariolga, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the community land trust model, what does a collective land title mean in practice, and why did you choose this model specifically in your work?
Pues buenos días, buenas tardes
Good
y buenas
morning,
noches.
good afternoon, good evening.
Primero que todo,
First of
agradecida de
all,
World Habitat por
I
continuar la
want to
colaboración
thank
ya
World Habitat for
básicamente a 10
continuing
años
this
de
collaboration.
habernos cruzado
It's
los caminos
been 10
por
years
primera vez
already
y agradecida de
since we
compartir
met for
aquí
the
con el resto
first
de los
time.
panelistas y
And also
conocer más
thank you to the
de sus
other
experiencias y sus
panelists
proyectos.
and for sharing
Así
your
que un poco,
experiences and
¿qué es
projects.
el modelo del
So,
fideicomiso de
what
la
is
tierra?
the
Lo primero que hay que
CLT
conocer es que es
model?
un
Well,
modelo que
first, you
nace
need to
para
know
allá para
it's a
los
model
años 60
that
en los
started
Estados
in the
Unidos,
60s
una
in the States.
respuesta
It
a
was
toda la crisis también de
response
derechos
to all
civiles
the civil
y la
rights
desigualdad y el
crisis
racismo que se
and
estaba viviendo en Estados
inequality
Unidos.
and the
Y lo
racism that was
importante es que
seen
ha
in the United
trascendido
States.
el
And it's
espacio
important that
geográfico
it has
de los
gone
Estados Unidos y ha
beyond
trascendido,
the
ha
US
logrado
and it has
trascender
gone beyond
sus orígenes en el sentido que ha
its
logrado seguir
origins because it has
dispersándose por el
managed
mundo
to
y otros
spread all over
países,
the
otros
world to
continentes,
other
otras regiones
countries,
y
other
otras realidades
continents, other
han ido
regions, and other
adaptando lo que es el modelo
realities
del
that have
fideicomiso de la
adopted
tierra, como es
the
el caso
CLT
del
model,
Caño Martín Peña
as
en
is the
Puerto Rico.
case of
Así que un
Martin Peña
fideicomiso de
Channel
tierra lo
in
que
Puerto
plantea
Rico.
es
So
que
what the
tiene
community land
unos
trust
residentes o tiene unos
is that
miembros, tiene unas
there's some
personas que son
residents or
las
some members and people
custodias de un
that
bien
are the
común, en este caso la
custodians of a
tierra, las
common good. In
casas,
this
va a
case, the
depender, ¿verdad?, el
land,
modelo
the
de
houses,
fideicomiso
it will
particular
depend
del cual se esté
on the
hablando,
trust
pero
model.
estas personas,
But
que es el
these
community,
people, the
custodian
community, are the
la tierra
custodians of the
en ese
land
fideicomiso para el
in
mejor
that
bienestar
trust
de lo que ese
for the
grupo haya
well-being
decidido.
of and
El
for what that
modelo
group
más
has
común que
decided to
se
do. The
ha
most common
dispersado del
model that has
fideicomiso es
spread
para trabajar lo que son
is
viviendas
to
asequibles, sobre todo en
work
contexto
on
urbano,
affordable
aunque
housing, particularly in
según pasan
urban
los años, como les
contexts.
comentaba,
Although,
hemos ido
as
viendo
time
cómo el
goes
modelo
by,
se ha
as I
seguido
said,
transformando.
we've seen
En el
this
caso del
model
Caño Martín
transform.
Peña se
In the case of
utilizó como
Martin
una
Peña,
herramienta para
it was used
regularizar
as a
la
tool
tenencia y
to
reconocer los derechos propietarios de familias que
legalize
habían
the
vivido en el
tenure and
corazón de
recognize
la
the
ciudadana
rights of
capital de
those
San
people
Juan
that
por
had
generaciones
lived
y que
in
no
that
tenían
city, in
nada que
San
les
Juan, for
acreditara
generations, but
o
they
les
had
reconociera sus
nothing
derechos.
to
Así es que en el
acknowledge their
caso
rights.
nuestro también vino
So,
de la
in
mano
our
con un proceso
case,
de planificación
this came
participativa
hand in
y el
hand with a
desarrollo de un plan de
participatory
desarrollo
process,
integral,
and it was a
el cual
comprehensive
busca unas mejoras
development
urbanas y un
process.
redesarrollo en
The
sitio que
idea is
podía y
to
puede
achieve urban
generar grandes procesos
improvements and an
especulativos y
upgrading,
un poco la comunidad
something
comenzó
that
a hacerse
might
distintas
lead to
preguntas
speculation.
en
So the
búsqueda
community started
de
asking different
protegerse a sí mismas,
questions in
pero
order
sobre
to
todo
protect
proteger a las futuras
themselves, but
generaciones a
particularly
seguir
to
teniendo
protect
acceso a la
future
ciudad
generations so they
y a
could
poder
continue having access to
que
the
se les
city
reconociera los derechos,
and
¿verdad?, de
to
quienes aquí habían
recognize
vivido
the
por años.
rights
Así
of
es que en
those that
ese
had lived there for
proceso,
years. So in
cómo se
that
decidió?
process,
Pues
how
durante
is
el
it that
mismo
we
proceso de
decided?
planificación
Well, during the
participativa surge
planning
la
process
pregunta,
itself,
¿cómo
the
nos
question came up.
protegemos? ¿Cómo
How
nos
will we
aseguramos?
protect
¿Cómo
ourselves?
evitamos que
How
se repita la
will we
historia de
prevent
comunidades
this from
vecinas
happening
del
again
área que
in
ya habían
neighboring
sido
communities in
desplazadas
the
bajo la
area
misma
that had
excusa,
been
¿no?, de
displaced already
redesarrollo
under the
y
same
bajo la misma
excuse
excusa de
of
que estaban en zonas
development and
inundables
under the same
o que
excuse
era un
that they
problema
were
de salud y
in
seguridad? Así
flood-prone
es que en ese
areas, that
proceso
it
se
was a
buscaron
question of
distintas
safety.
alternativas y se
So
fueron
we looked for
evaluando.
different options and we
Se
evaluated them.
compararon, hubo distintos
We
talleres con el liderato
compared, I mean, there were
comunitario y
different
con residentes de las
workshops with
comunidades, en el
community
cual se
leaders and with
comparó tres
residents
modelos. Se
where we
comparó
compare
los
three
títulos individuales
models.
de propiedad, que es el
Individual
modelo más
titles to
conocido acá en
property, that
Puerto
is the
Rico.
most
Se
popular model
compararon las
here in
cooperativas
Puerto
de
Rico.
vivienda y
We
cooperativas de
compare the
solares, que aquí en
housing
Puerto Rico había
cooperatives,
algunas
that
experiencias
there
para
were
aquel
some
entonces,
experiences here in
y
Puerto
se
Rico by
trajo,
then.
¿verdad? Se
And
importó desde los Estados
we
Unidos lo
imported
que era el
from the
modelo del
US
fideicomiso de tierra.
the trust model,
En
the
ese proceso de
community land
análisis,
trust
la
model.
gente
So during
identificó
that
que el
analysis
fideicomiso
process,
brindaba
people
lo mejor de los
identified
dos
that
mundos.
the CLT
Brindaba
gave them the
el
best of
reconocimiento
both both
individual y
worlds.
los
On the
derechos
one hand, the
individuales sobre las
individual
propiedades,
recognition of
pero a
the
su
right to
vez brindaba
their
las
property,
garantías
but at the same
colectivas de que
time,
todos los terrenos
collective
iban a ser custodiados y
assurance that all
protegidos
the land was going
por
to be
los residentes
protected
del caño, por las
by the
comunidades y por las
residents,
estructuras que
by
aquí
the
existen para
communities,
custodiar este
and by the
proyecto
structures that
comunitario.
exist here
Así es que
to
en ese
protect
análisis, pues la
this
gente
community
optó y
project.
decidió, ¿verdad?,
So
por
after that
instaurar el
analysis,
fideicomiso de tierra.
the
En
community
nuestro caso,
decided
fuimos el
for
primer
the
fideicomiso de
CLT
tierra,
model. We were the
fuimos creados
first
por una ley
CLT. We were
que da
created by
vida a
an
todo el
act
proceso de desarrollo
that
integral que se está
started
gestando acá en las
this
comunidades del caño y
development
le da
process
vida
that is
a lo que es
happening
el
in the
fideicomiso de la
communities, and it
tierra.
gave life to the
Creo que
CLT.
algo importante que se
And
pueden
I
llevar
think something
sobre qué es
important
un
that you can take
fideicomiso,
home
pues
about
mire,
it, what a
una
trust
manera
is
de
that
ser
it's a
inclusivos
way
a la
of
hora de
being
manejar y tener el
inclusive
control sobre
when it
las
comes
tierras y
to
sobre el
managing and
desarrollo de la
having
gente.
control
Es
over
una
the land
herramienta,
and
es
over
una
the
alternativa
development.
que tienen
It's a
las
tool,
personas para
it's an
ser protagonistas
alternative
de
that
su
people have
desarrollo
to be
y
the
custodiarlo en el mejor
protagonists
interés
of
de
their
sus propias
development and
comunidades
to
y de sus
protect
propios
their own
grupos. Al menos así es
communities.
como nosotros lo
That is
visualizamos.
how we see it.
Y a su vez, pues tiene múltiples
And
beneficios
it
como
has
promover vivienda
many benefits,
asequible,
like
promover
promoting
desarrollo
affordable
equitativo,
housing,
puedes promover
promoting
justicia
equitable
ambiental, entre muchos
development,
otros aspectos.
environmental protection,
Mensaje
among many other
importante, el fideicomiso de la
aspects.
tierra es una
An
herramienta y
important
las
thing is
herramientas
that the
uno las va
CLT
adaptando a lo que
is
uno
a tool
necesita. Esa fue
that you
nuestra
adapt to
experiencia, fue
what
la
you need.
primera vez,
That was
¿verdad?
our
Como bien
experience.
mencionó
It was
Abigail,
the
que
first
se
time, as Abby
implementa y que se
mentioned,
desarrolla un
that this was
fideicomiso
implemented
a nivel de Latinoamérica, a nivel
in
del
Latin
Caribe, una de
America
las
and the
primeras
Caribbean.
experiencias
It
a
was one
nivel
of the
del sur
first
global
experiences
y
in the
una de las
Global
primeras
South.
experiencias
And it was one of
también
the
en
first
adaptarlo
experiences
para
also
contextos de
in
comunidades
adapting it
autoconstruidas.
to
Entonces vamos
self-constructed
viendo cómo, ¿verdad?
communities.
Un
So
modelo que
we
se crea
see
de una
how
manera
a
muy
model that
particular
was
se puede
created in a
seguir
very particular
transformando
way
según la
can
necesidad del grupo que lo
transform
va a utilizar y que lo va a
itself
aplicar.
based on the
Así es
group that
que
is
nada,
going
un
to
poco
use
que
it.
se lleven
So
eso
that is what I want to share with
y
you.
un poco que
And
manejar y custodiar
also
bienes de
that
manera
managing
colectiva no es
well
sencillo,
this and collectively is not
requiere
an easy
paciencia, requiere
task. It requires
compromiso,
patience,
pero sobre todas las
commitment,
cosas también
engagement,
requiere
but
mucho,
it mainly
mucho y constante
requires
desarrollo de liderazgo al interior de la
permanent
organización,
development of leadership inside
promover
the
constantes
organization,
procesos de
promote
organización comunitaria y
permanent
fortalecimiento
organization
de esa organización
processes, the
comunitaria
strengthening of that
y
community
reflejándonos un
organization.
poco en la experiencia que nos
And
comparte el compañero,
And now thinking
requiere lo que
of
son las alianzas tanto a
experience
nivel
from
público y nivel
Indonesia, it
privado.
also requires
Sin la alianza es
partnerships at a public
muy
and private
complicado
level.
sacar este
Without
tipo de
those
proyectos
partnerships,
a
it's
flote y
very
sacarlos
complicated
adelante.
to move
Y
ahead
esas
with these
alianzas pues tienen
projects.
distintos
And those
límites,
partnerships
distintas fronteras
has
y nos
different
hacen sentir más o menos
limits,
incómodos,
and it
pero
makes they
ciertamente
make
algo
us
que hay que
feel
tener sobre
more
la
or
mesa y
less
que es algo que hay
comfortable, but
que
it's
tener
something that you have to
presente.
consider.
Thank you very much. I really, it's a real pleasure to just also hear how it's not just for your community as it is, but the future generations of your community, which is just something I think that for housing around the world and also the kind of climate crisis is just something that we all need to have that perspective on. So to hear that framing was really interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to David. And ask him about the Housing Support Act because they have managed to do just a pretty remarkable piece of legislation. So, David, my question for you is what does the Housing Support Act require of government, and what is the legal obligation in it now that wasn't there before when it came to homelessness and homeless prevention?
Okay. Hi to all of you. I would like to describe briefly the situation that was in Czech Republic since 1990, before there was a communist era, and there were almost 30% of the houses were municipal houses or municipal flats. And it was pretty easy to find some solution for the people that were in crisis. But during 90s and after 2000, all the municipalities start to sell the flats because it was too difficult to care about all the flats, and also it was an easy way for the municipalities to get some extra money. And suddenly in some cities or towns, the amount of social houses fell almost to zero, or really to zero. But in some big cities like Brno, they have still something like 35,000 flats, and it's quite easy to find a solution till now there for people that are in housing need. And 2013, there were many experts in all the areas that start to feel that we really need something like a Housing Support Act and solution that will be even in the legal frame, and that we will have some long-term solution. So at that period, there was a massive tsunami of drugs coming to Czech Republic, like illegal drugs, and suddenly many people were evicted from their homes, and we found out that there is something we call triple trouble, which is a combination of homelessness, serious addiction, and some mental disease. And for these people, there are no trajectories how to get back to some nice and nice solution, a nice flat with some dignity. So the expert connected together and start to accent this topic or stress this topic, and pointing out that there is a solution. So we were looking abroad, all around the world, where are the most effective solutions, and start to prepare this act. But it was in 2013, so it took us almost 13 years to get through this really ambitious plan. We were like pointing out that it's really important to shift from crisis management to some systematic prevention. So the act fundamentally shifts Czech Republic response to homelessness and housing precarity from a reactive ad hoc crisis management to some systematic and proactive prevention. So this is something really important. And there is also the way how to institutionalize permanent infrastructure. It established a clear legal framework to housing contact points, which are places where people can ask for help in various situations. These contact points should be across municipalities, providing dedicated advice assessment and direct navigation to housing support. These experts are usually like really good in pointing or navigating the people through the system and helping them to find some solution for themselves. It also creates backstage guarantees and assistance tools for rental housing, as well as regularized funding for housing social work. And there is also a predictable framework for those that are in need, and instead of relying on short-term or fragmented pilot projects, the Act creates a durable framework to address the needs of the 160,000 people living in severe housing distress in Czech Republic. There are also 60,000 children in temporary in temporary housing, which is our goal to get all of these children out of this serious and really bad accommodation. Yeah, so these are the most important things that we have in this Housing Support Act.
Thank you very much. And it is remarkable when we speak to awardees as well, and they speak about the time that it has taken. 13 years, it's a tireless effort, I feel like. And we often have those conversations and see that is the kind of process it has taken and the determination. So I really applaud you for getting this act through, to be honest. And it's a real benchmark and a case study for the rest of us. Now, I just want to quickly remind people that they can introduce themselves on the chat, as well as put questions into the Q&A function. And with that, I will move on to my own question to Julieta. and ask, how do you think about the difference between these kinds of local or national legal tools and the international human rights framework you work with? Where does one end and the other begin? I know it's a hard question in my mind, but here's to you.
Well, thank you, Abby, and thank you to all the presenters. All of these case studies are so inspirational and have been so inspirational for our work. But this question is particularly nice because it allows me to be slightly controversial. I think the question kind of assumes that there is a border between the international human rights framework and local or national legal tools. And I want to push back on that a little because I don't think the border is actually there. The way that we see it at the Shift, we really see it as one framework that's operating at different levels, not different systems or two separate systems, one international and one domestic. And I'll just explain this really starting with the international layers. So what does the international layer do for human rights law? So this is really where governments set out what obligations they have towards their people. So the right to adequate housing, the right to be free from forced evictions, the obligation to progressively realize these rights and to not go backwards. Most countries around the world, if not almost all of them, have signed up to this right and to uphold this right. They've ratified oftentimes the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or another covenant that actually lays out these rights. If you're anywhere in Europe at the moment, oftentimes the right to housing is in your constitution, or you've definitely signed up to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So when we talk about the right to housing, we're not actually importing some foreign standard and asking a government to consider it. We're actually talking about a commitment that the government has already made. And that really, really matters because when you're a community member, when you're an individual experiencing a violation, the conversation goes from this should be a right to you've already agreed to this right. So let's talk about how you're implementing it, whether you're implementing it or if you're violating it. So the international framework is really, really good at one thing, and it's a lot weaker at another thing. So what it's really good at is telling us what the right actually means. So when you read a general comment that comes from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights or the Human Rights Committee, or if you read a report from a special rapporteur or a review from a treaty body, what you're getting is a really clear shared account of what a right to housing actually requires in practice. So not just a roof, but security of tenure, affordability, habitability, access to services, protection from eviction. Abby, you went through some of these already in your intro. So these tools really give communities and governments vocabulary for how to implement the right, and how to advocate for the right. They let a tenant that's facing eviction and a housing minister understand the right in the exact same terms. And that's obviously not a small thing. A lot of the work that we do with local governments and with communities is just getting everyone to agree on what the right actually demands. But where the international framework is really, really weak, obviously, is in enforcement. There is no global sheriff, there's no real global court. And unfortunately, even the special rapporteur can't mandate a stop to a bulldozer. So that's really where we need national and local tools to come in. This is the enforcement layer. Courts, legislation, budgets, administrative processes. This is really where the right stops being a principle in a treaty and becomes something concrete. Someone keeps their home, a community gets rehoused instead of displaced. Money actually flows towards social housing. Domestic law is really the delivery mechanism, and it's finally where this abstract concept reaches the person or the community. So the two levels should ideally be covering each other's weaknesses. International law is really strong on setting the standards, but weak on enforcing it, while domestic law should be strong on enforcement, but is only ever as ambitious as the political will in the room, as probably all of us know too well. but they really are meant to feed into each other. The standards set internationally are designed to flow down into national law, and that's really the whole point of ratifying a treaty. But it also runs the other way too. What's actually happening on the ground, the evictions, the financialization of housing, the ways housing systems are failing people, that flows back up and sharpens how the standards get interpreted, so that the framework isn't actually static. So we have an international legal framework, a human rights framework that's learning from local reality and that's adapting. So when I do get asked this, where does international law end, or what's the use of international law and how is it supposed to influence domestic law? Obviously, my answer is that the system is porous and it's meant to be porous. It's meant to flow back and forth into each other. But where the real tension lies, and really where all of our work is never really international law versus national law, but rather the gap between what governments have committed to and what they actually deliver and how they're actually implementing those human rights. What is that gap between the standard that they signed in those international covenants and the housing systems that people are actually living in and the violations they're experiencing? This is the gap where all of our work sits in. And every single tool, every legal tool in particular, at every level, really exists to close that gap. And I think there couldn't be better examples than the ones on this panel about how we use legal tools to close the gap between international human rights law and domestic law and implementation.
I'm so glad that we asked that question that kind of could be challenged in such a way, because I think that's a really interesting way of, well, not just interesting, kind of accurate way of putting it, in this idea that it's porous, that this isn't static, and that the two can inform each other to create a better housing system overall. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Gugun, I'm back to you for our second question. And I really wanted to get your opinion on this contract, because I also know that you had all tried many different kinds of approaches. You do a kind of multi-action way of trying to protect communities at risk of eviction and restore their rights. I'm quite curious what made you think that a contract was the best way to secure your housing rights. And you've spoken a bit about it already, but also what leverage specifically did the community have going into negotiations? And I think that comes down to what you were talking about with the votes and kind of, the power of the communities you were working with at the time.
Okay, Abby. So I will not say that this is the best way. So I will say that we try everything we can do. And this is also the good chance to change the political situation in our society, that we face that every election, the poor people is always harassment by the candidates. They only give the promises, they fake promises, they give this small amount of money, but they didn't have a good track record work with the community. But they want to elect by the community. They want the food from the community. So, and it's always also make a problem in the society. They fight each other in the community to win their candidate. So I think it's also the good chance to change the situations, not only about to secure the housing rights, but also to change the democratic situation in our society. But yes, this is a new experiment for us, and we make it. There's some achievement we got it there. So we will do in many strategy that we want to that we can make it. And also, I think in every election, the candidate need the voter. This is the only one times in 5 years the poor people suddenly become valuable because they need the food. They need the food. So, but if we only use our rights to food, individually, one by one. There is no power. It's only used by the candidate to get the position. So the idea is when the community working together and working together and they unite the votes and change to the demands to the candidates for long-term benefit, it will be useful. And then suddenly the candidate see the poor people not as individual, not as individual voter, but as a groups, as a communities. So that's the position is better in front of the candidates. Back to you.
Thank you. One one small question back to that is the kind of political involvement of the community. And I remember that you had all organized through cooperatives. Are they still the way that the community can remain politically involved? Have they kind of kept their political involvement through, how does that sustain really the community's political involvement?
Yeah, we built the housing cooperative network not only in Jakarta but in Indonesia. And if we only take a look on the political moment or election, we will think, oh, this is not sustainable. But like I said before, the political contract is only the entry point. It's only beginning. So after the governor term is done, we continue with our work. But in the 5 years, we stop until now. Actually, they stop the eviction in the city and also change the policy. So our demand is beyond the community. I mean, because we demand the policy changing, and also with the achievement, our experience in 5 years. So we have like a capital to continue our movement, our struggle to leverage our community.
Thank you. I think it's amazing how this project around evictions and land and community rights has led into kind of rethinking an overall how to have an overall democratic process and what it is a democracy, or at least a country using democratic systems, how they should be adhered and improved on. It's really interesting. Mariolga, I'm going to come to you next, and also to kind of speak about institutions. To ask you, what was the hardest institutional resistance you had to overcome? Because as we've both mentioned, community land trusts were not well established yet in your area. And so did you find significant challenges to progressing this model? And also, how did you address those challenges?
Bueno,
Well,
ciertamente la
yeah,
implementación de este
certainly
tipo de
the
proyectos
implementation of this
va a
kind of
conllevar
projects
retos y
has
desafíos
challenges
sin
and
importar, ¿verdad?
difficulties,
El
regardless
contexto o la
of the
localidad donde se
context
estén
or the
desarrollando.
location
Tampoco
where it's being
somos
carried out.
proyectos, incluyendo,
We
¿verdad?
are
a los proyectos que
projects,
representan los compañeros, que hasta cierto
as
punto
well as the
estamos
projects
nadando en
from our
contra de la
partners,
corriente.
that
Como bien
we
decía
are
Julieta,
like
estamos buscando llevar
moving
a la práctica
against
eso
the
que se
current. I
legisla
mean,
o eso que se escribe,
we are
¿verdad? A
trying
nivel
to
de derecho
enforce
internacional.
what
Y
is
eso siempre va a
legislated
encontrar unas
in terms of
resistencias,
international human rights, and
unos
that will
conflictos y unos
always
retos
find resistance and
en su
conflicts
desarrollo y
and
en su quehacer.
challenges
En nuestro
in
caso,
its development.
les voy a
In our
compartir
case,
dos
I'm
retos
going to share a couple of
externos y dos retos
challenges,
internos, y un
two
poco
external
cómo
and
los
two
hemos ido
internal,
manejando con
and
los
how
años.
we manage them
El primer
along the
reto
years. The
externo
first external
fue
challenge
cuando se introduce la
was
idea y se
when
desarrolla
the
y se incluye
idea
en el
was
proyecto de ley la
introduced,
figura del fideicomiso de la tierra.
the idea
Eso
of the
desató
CLT
acá en
was
Puerto
introduced
Rico
in
una
the
guerra
bill.
ideológica y
That
filosófica.
started an
Para
ideological
quienes
and
no
philosophical
sepan, pues
war in Puerto Rico.
tiene una
If you're not
relación
aware,
colonial con los
Puerto
Estados
Rico
Unidos,
has like a colonial relationship
y
with the
a
United
pesar
States.
que el modelo
And
de fideicomisos
although
se crea
the
en los Estados
trust
Unidos y
model
que
was
en el
created
cual
in the United
el
States,
caño se basa uno
and
en la ciudad de
Martin
aún así
Caño
se
project
comenzó a
was based
tergiversar y a
in
utilizar
Boston.
mucha terminología
Anyway,
política
a lot of political
e
terminology was
ideológica para atacar la
used, and
figura del
ideological
fideicomiso.
terminology to
Entonces,
attack the
teníamos al
community
alcalde
land
de la
trust.
ciudad y a
So
otros
we had the
políticos que
mayor
tenían
of the
acceso a
city
los
and
medios
other
de
politicians
comunicación
that had access to the
hablando en contra del
media, and they were
fideicomiso,
speaking
hablando en contra del
against the
trabajo que hacían los
trust,
líderes comunitarios,
against the work done by
planteaban que esto
community
era
leaders.
comunismo, que
They
esto
said
era
this
como
was
que traer a Hugo
communism,
Chávez directo de
that
Venezuela
this
para
was like
acá,
bringing Hugo
a
Chavez
San
directly
Juan.
from
Así que
Venezuela to
hubo
San
mucha
Juan. So there was a
tergiversación sobre
lot
lo que
of
es un fideicomiso,
attacks
la figura de lo que es, lo que hace,
defamation
lo que
against what the
busca,
CLT
y hubo
does,
mucho
what it
ataque directo.
intends to
Tan
do. And there were
así
many direct attacks.
que en el
So much so
2009 el
that
alcalde
in
de la ciudad
2009, the mayor
de
of
San
the
Juan en
city
aquel
in San
entonces llevó
Juan,
a cabo una
the
demanda
mayor
junto
at
con
the
la
time,
legislatura y nos quitan los
filed a
terrenos que
lawsuit
custodia
in
el
court,
fideicomiso
and
de la
they
tierra y
took the land
estuvimos 4
away
años
from us.
básicamente, ¿verdad? En una
And for
batalla legal
4
en los
years, we were
tribunales, en
in
distintos
a
foros
court battle
judiciales
in
acá en Puerto
different
Rico y en
levels
Estados Unidos,
in Puerto Rico
defendiendo
and in the
la
US,
existencia del
defending the
fideicomiso, el
existence
derecho
of the
que tenían
trust
los residentes de
and the
decidir cómo
right
querían manejar sus
residents
tierras,
had to
etcétera.
decide how they
Pero eso
wanted to
fue un
manage
daño
their land,
muy
etc. But there
grande
was a very big
porque no
damage
puedes comparar el
because
acceso a los medios que
you
pueden tener
cannot
proyectos
compare the
comunitarios
access
como los
to the
nuestros versus el
media
acceso que
of
tienen
our projects versus
legisladores,
the access to the
alcaldes, tienen
media that
todo el aparato de
legislators or the
comunicaciones
mayor can
para de
have.
una
They have
manera bien
all the system
abayazadora
to support them. And they
aplanar,
were
¿verdad? Y
overwhelmingly
básicamente casi
attacking
silenciar.
the
Aún
trust.
así, la comunidad
Anyway,
estuvo
the
organizada todo ese
community
tiempo,
was
realizaron
organized throughout.
manifestaciones,
They
se
held
buscó apoyo de
demonstrations.
aliados y aliadas
We
en
looked for
distintos
the
sectores del
support of
país, sobre
partners
todo en
in
la
different sectors of the
academia,
country,
se tuvo ¿verdad?
particularly in
Las
academia.
demandas y los casos legales que hubo que llevar, pero eso a
Uh,
su vez
we went to
nos trajo
court,
un reto
but that
adicional y
also
fue que en
meant
la
an additional
demanda la
challenge. And that
comunidad le
was that
decía al
in the
gobierno, bueno, si me
lawsuit,
vas a quitar los terrenos,
the
me tienes que
community said, well,
me tienes que
if you're
pagar
going
la
to take
justa
the land away from
compensación
us, then
por
you
los
have to
terrenos.
compensate me for that.
Estamos hablando de más de
So it
85
was
hectáreas de
more
terreno en plena
than
capital.
85
El gobierno no tenía
hectares
el
of
dinero
land in
para
the middle of
pagar.
the
La
city.
intención
The
de la
government did
comunidad
not have the
nunca
money
fue
to
que
pay
se le
for that.
pagaran las
But the
tierras,
intention of the
simplemente era
community
una
was never
estrategia
to be
legal para
paid
ganar
for the land. It
tiempo
was
en
just
lo
a
que
legal
se daba y se
strategy to
concretaba un
earn
cambio
time
político y se
to
daban, ¿verdad? Unos
make this
cambios de
political
actores en el
change.
panorama
And
político del
we
país.
were also waiting for
Pero
changes
se utilizó
in the
eso para
political
plantear
actors
dónde
in the
están los
country. But
millones,
that was
acusar al
used
liderato
to
comunitario de
say,
haberse quedado
what
con
are
el
the
dinero que se les
millions?
pagó por las
What
tierras,
are
que eso
the
no fue
millions
cierto.
that they
Y
were
eso es
paid
una
for the
sombra,
land, which
¿verdad? Que
was not
muchos
true?
años después,
And that is
quienes vivieron esa
something
época, pues
that
todavía recuerdan y nos puede perseguir en cierto
we
modo.
still
Otro
remember. It was a
aspecto
very hard
externo, otro
battle.
reto externo
Another
muy
external
significativo
challenge that was
es
very
que debido a
significant
esa misma guerra
is that because of
ideológica,
that ideological
sobre todo
war
que percoló a las agencias gubernamentales con las
that
cuales teníamos que relacionarnos y todavía tenemos que relacionarnos para
was
hacer nuestros
also, I
trabajos,
mean, the
generó muy
idea of
poca
the government
colaboración
agencies we
de
had
los
to deal
funcionarios
with,
de esas agencias
that
en brindar
resulted in very
información,
poor
en acceder a
collaboration from
reuniones, en que se pudieran aclarar los
government
asuntos y
officials.
eso
They
hizo
didn't
que
give
los
us
primeros años de
information.
nuestros
And
trabajos,
as a
de hecho,
result, in the
hasta que
first years
ganamos
of
el
our
Premio
work,
Mundial del Hábitat, para nosotros
until we
eso
won the
representó un
first World
antes y un
Habitat
después
Award,
en nuestro
actually, that was a
contexto
turning
local, ¿verdad? Y
point
de
in
cómo
our
se nos
local
percibía y cómo
context
se nos
and in
trata
how we were
y cómo se nos
perceived
trató
and
en aquel
treated
entonces. Eso fue un
at
game
the time.
changer
It
para
was
nosotros
really a game
realmente.
changer for
Pues
us.
había muy poca colaboración,
There
muy
was,
poca
before that, there
colaboración.
was very
Así
little
es que un poco
collaboration.
cómo lo hemos atendido esos
So
retos
how
a
did we
nivel
deal with
interno,
those
pues
challenges?
básicamente con
Well,
mucha educación y capacitación.
basically with
Cada vez que hay
education
cambios de
and
gobierno,
training,
nosotros
whenever there are
hacemos unas
changes in the
rondas,
government,
distintas rondas con
we
las agencias
hold different
gubernamentales de
rounds with the
educación, de
government
explicar,
agencies
de
to explain.
volverlo y volverlo a explicar cuantas veces sean
And we
necesarias
explain
a
as many
los
times as
funcionarios
necessary
electos
to the
de
new
gobierno,
officials,
a
the
los
new elected
empleados gubernamentales
government
de otras
officials, and
agencias,
also
para
the
un poco que entiendan la ley
employees from the different
489, que es
government
la ley que crea
agencies,
el fideicomiso
so
de la
they
tierra, que entienda el
understand the law
fideicomiso de la tierra y
489,
que
the law
podamos
that
entablar
creates the
colaboraciones.
community
Pero esos
land
son
trust,
procesos
so
que
we
toman
can have a
mucho tiempo.
collaboration. But it's a
Pudiera
process that
parecer
takes a lot
que
of
es algo
time.
sencillo, pero como
It
bien
may
decía el
sound easy,
compañero
but
David,
as our
pues son
colleague
procesos a
David
largo
said,
plazo.
these are
Y ahorita
long-term
yo les planteaba
processes.
que hace falta paciencia y compromiso a
And
largo
you need
plazo y es por este tipo
patience
de
and
dinámica.
commitment and engagement engagement because of
Otro
this
aspecto interno y
dynamic.
otro reto y cómo lo
Another
hemos ido trabajando con
challenge
los
and
años
how we dealt with it along the
es
years
que
is
en el caso nuestro éramos el
the
primer
fact
fideicomiso,
that
así que
in
había
our
muchas
case we
cosas
were
que
the
era la primera
first
vez
community
que las
land trust and
estábamos
we were the
haciendo. Así es que un
many
poco
things were
encontrar
being done
esas
for the first time.
personas
So we had to
colaboradoras
find
en la
those
creación de
people that would
documentos, de
collaborate with us
procesos,
in the
rebotar
creation of
ideas con otros
documents, in
grupos fuera
processes,
de Puerto Rico en
brainstorming
aquel
ideas
entonces que
with
ya
other
estuvieran
groups,
establecidos
even
para poder validar
outside
un poco
Puerto
lo que
Rico
estábamos
that had
haciendo,
already established
tener
this so they
análisis
could
del marco
validate what we
legal.
were
Eso fue
doing.
sumamente
The
importante,
legal
¿verdad? En los
framework
primeros años
analysis, that was
para
very important in
poder
the first
sobrellevar
years
esos retos
in order
iniciales de
to
poner
overcome those
andar,
initial challenges
¿verdad? La organización.
for our
Otro reto que tal
organization.
vez pudiera
Other
pasar
challenges
desapercibido
that
es
perhaps
las
may go
expectativas colectivas
unnoticed
versus las
is the
expectativas
collective
individuales.
expectations
Nosotros,
versus
¿verdad?
individual
Nuestro
expectations.
ente fiscalizador y que nos moviliza y
Our
de gobernanza, una
regulator
coalición de
is
liderato
the
comunitario, pero
coalition of
dentro de
community
esa
leadership,
coalición hay
but
11
within that
organizaciones
coalition there are
de base
11
comunitaria. Y
organizations,
eso conlleva que tú tienes
community-based
múltiples
organizations.
mentes,
So you have
visiones,
multiple
perspectivas de cómo
minds,
deben ser las
multiple
cosas y a
visions,
pesar
multiple
de que se lleva
perspectives
a
of what
cabo
things should
unos
look
distintos
like.
ejercicios, ¿verdad?
And
Sobre
although we
definiciones
do different
comunes,
exercises
siempre va a haber
about
un
common
elemento de
definitions,
expectativa
there will
individual
always
sumada a la
be an
expectativa
individual
colectiva y eso
expectation
se puede
added to the
volver
collective
retante. ¿Cómo
expectation, and that
trabajamos
can
eso? Pues
become a
espacios
challenge.
constantes de trabajo
And
con
we
la
worked
comunidad.
on that
Hemos
with
creado distintos comités
constant
de
spaces
trabajo
with the
sobre
community.
distintos
We
temas
created
para poder un
working
poco
committees on different
o
topics
redefinir esas
to
expectativas o cerrar las
redefine those
brechas entre
expectations
lo que es
or
la
to bridge the
expectativa y lo que es la
gaps between
realidad de
the
lo que podemos
expectations and the
trabajar.
reality of what we can do.
Quisiera destacar rápidamente
I
que
would like
hoy
to
en día en
highlight
Puerto
very
Rico ya
briefly
somos 5
that today in
fideicomisos
Puerto Rico there
adicionales.
are 5
Había una
additional
pregunta en el chat
trusts,
un poco de cómo
and there was
mantenemos
a question in the
el
chat as
tema
to how
del balance
we
con la ecología. En
maintain
el caso de
the
nuestro
balance
proyecto
with the
principal, que es el dragado de un cuerpo de agua,
environment.
se va a
In our case,
restaurar
it's the
y
dredging
se
of a
van a volver a
water
sembrar mangles a lo largo de
stream.
ese cuerpo de
There
agua.
will be
Y la
mangroves
expectativa
along
es que
the
una vez mejore la
water
calidad
stream.
del
And the
agua y se
expectation is that once
restaure
the quality of the
con la siembra
water
de mangles, pues
is
todo lo que tiene que ver
restored
con la
with the
biodiversidad va a mejorar
mangroves,
también. Pero sí quería
everything that
aclarar
has
que
to
en
do
nuestro
with
contexto es un contexto
biodiversity
urbano, no
will
tenemos
also improve.
demasiada área
But
en ese sentido
this is
que
an
proteger, más
urban
allá que el
context,
propio
so we
cuerpo
don't
de
have
agua
such
que
a
es el
big
canal.
area to
En el caso de
protect
Puerto Rico,
beyond
sí
the
hay dos
channel.
experiencias
In
muy
Puerto Rico, there are
interesantes
two very
de
interesting
fideicomisos que
experiences
fueron creados
of
y están
trusts
trabajando
that
el
were
tema de la
created and
agroecología.
are working on the environmental aspects.
Niall, it'd be great to if you can put the names of those trusts as well in the chat. That's I joined World Habitat after a long time after you all awarded, and just to hear about the challenges that you all went through, and especially that ideological fight. I just think it's truly remarkable how you've all addressed it and sustained it for so many years. So thank you so much for outlining that. David, I'm on to you. So I think that one of the things that we really found fascinating about your project was your work with municipalities across the country to kind of get this act through and supported by. So I think one of the questions I wanted to ask was, you've built relationships with municipalities right across the country over the past few years. How did that collaboration develop? We were actually just talking about partnerships now and the importance of those partnerships and having municipalities alongside. So how did those collaborations develop, and how did working with them shape both the legislation and its rollout?
Yeah. We have really long-term cooperation, and there are 20 cities with the highest number of people in housing need, especially in rough homelessness. And these are the cities we are trying to cooperate with the most. And we are trying to get the bottom up and co-design the services for all the people that are in this housing need. So our partnership were forged on ground through practical implementation of housing first projects and early local housing offices. Real world municipal experience directly shaped the initial drafting of the law, and it's based also on the like personal relationship with the politicians and local stakeholders, that we are trying to spend with them a lot of time and talk about all the things they face and find the individual solution for every area, which is something really important. We spend the more time you spend with these people, the more deeper the relationship is, and then the more smooth is the cooperation. And then there is also the shaping of the legislation through practical feedback. We are trying to get feedback from local leaders, which was crucial during the legislative process. And we are also trying to include their opinions on various topics and their own suggestions, and it help us to advocate for key refinements such as adjusting income thresholds and broadening access to contact points, ensuring the law reflects local realities rather than just abstract bureaucracy. And which was also really important, was creating a network for effective rollout, which we call partnership, where we meet together and we are discussing the special topics that are typical in this area and that require some specific solutions. So this is also a network of clever and efficient, good examples of practice where they share their good practices. And working directly with the cities created something like a peer learning network of mayors, local officials, and social workers, which are included in this network and trying to cooperate and inspire each other. And this frontline readiness is what ensures the act to move smoothly from legal text into something that will be tangible and impact across all the communities. So this is something we are trying to do at least 5 times a year, these meetings of the municipalities and sharing with them some new procedures, or we invite some experts even from abroad or foreign experts that are like presenting us some good practices from their countries.
Yeah, I think this was something in your award application, the kind of extensive work with municipalities to understand exactly their barriers, and to make sure that was really incorporated into the legislation, because participation means participation from basically all the stakeholders involved, and the extent of the work you did to continue to understand that is pretty remarkable.
Maybe I
Julieta,
should mention that we are also trying to
go ahead.
include also the peer workers and the people that have their own
Yes.
experience from the life at the streets.
Yeah, exactly. Julieta, this is quite a short question, but it begs a quite large answer, to be fair. The question is, what legal tools do you find the most durable in securing housing rights?
Yes, I'm going to be brief because I'm going to be brief to give time for the Q&A. So just very quickly, I think it's really important to know that what actually holds a right in place, and it's rarely, very rarely, just a legal tool on its own, as we've heard from the examples of the amazing practices on this call. So it matters. It definitely matters when a government legislates the right to housing, for example. It matters when you can take that right to a court. Those are very real tools, but on their own, they are quite fragile. And a right that only exists on paper or in a courtroom can be underfunded, it can be ignored, it can be quietly rolled back, as we're seeing in a lot of places. So what really makes a tool durable is when there is an organized community behind it that's also willing to step up and defend it. So just some very brief examples, aside from the ones that we've heard today, because all of these are amazing ways to show what happens when there's a community that's organized and ready to advocate for a tool. But we saw, for example, and this could very well be considered a failure, in Berlin, tenants organized for years and forced a referendum to expropriate the largest corporate landlords. And while a majority voted yes, the government actually never implemented it. So it is a failure. But the campaign made Berlin risky enough that Achilles, which was the biggest corporate landlord at the time, actually sold its whole portfolio and left the city. So, that's actually quite a success because the community was organized behind it, even though the legal tool actually failed. In Denmark, similarly, Blackstone bought up a lot of older rental housing and then used rent evictions to push people out. People organized, and then the government passed the Blackstone law, which restricted this practice. And then I was going to cite the example of Jakarta, but Gugun has done that so much better than I could ever. And while he says maybe it wasn't the best tool, we just, whenever we can talk about Jakarta, we talk about Jakarta. It's such an amazing example of community coming together and demanding their rights and not waiting for their rights to be given to them. But just to give you a sense of a counter example. So what happens when you have a legal tool, but you don't have community backing? I'm in Canada. In 2019, Canada actually legislated the right to housing in the National Housing Strategy Act. And while there was actually a lot of civil society demand for a legislated right to housing, there wasn't a grassroots movement kind of demanding the right or knowing what the right was, and no grassroots movement to really put political pressure on the federal government. So what's happened since 2019? We have a legislated right to housing. We have a federal housing advocate. We have a national housing council. Everything is underfunded. Nothing is taken seriously. And there's no public outcry. So actually, we've made very little inroads into addressing the housing crisis. And Canada has staggering levels of homelessness. We have a large part of the population living in unaffordable housing or core housing need. And we don't have political pressure really forcing the government to do things differently or seriously implementing the right to housing. So we keep just status quo policies that keep housing very financialized and within the private market. So you can have the legal tools, and you can have great legal tools like a legislated right to housing, and yet they can mean nothing if there isn't that community support and the community backing to really push them forward. And I think that's what makes a legal tool the most durable and the most enforceable.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on to the Q&A with the audience. I do see that we have a question in the box, just to remind people that if they would like to either leave a message in the chat and we'll keep an eye out for it, or if you want to put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, you can do that. And Gugun, it's a question for you. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it. And it says, on which legal basis could you hold the candidate accountable in front of a court if after a successful election, the political contract was not respected? So say the candidate got elected and they still decided, you know what, I'm not going to adhere to this political contract. How could you hold that candidate accountable? And what kind of protection and remedies were provided by the contract to the community?
Yep. Thank you for the question. So in Indonesia, political promises during campaign periods are not legally binding. So the candidate used them to deceive the public mostly. So that's why we try to experimenting with the transforming political contract into legal contract by drafting the contract document that meet with the legal contract requirements. For example, our document, it's clearly defining the subject and object of the agreement. In the past, we have also the experience that only social contract, so it's like only a social declaration between the candidates and also the people, the voter, but it's not legal binding. And and we didn't have the experience before. You bring the social contract to the court, but we understand and we realize that the promises is not legally binding. So that's why we changed, the transform the social contract into the legal contract, and also we try to comply with the existing regulation. So there is a law in contract law in Indonesia that you cannot to make a law that you violate the regulation in Indonesia. So that's why we also invite the expert to check, to give comment, to give suggestion about the contract. We wrote the draft is very detailed, not only the general demand, general issue, but very detailed to comply with our legal system in Indonesia. But that, I will say again, that was experiment, because we didn't went to the court, because our evaluation that the governor at the time mostly fulfilled the agreement.
Thank you. I am just going to check the Q&A box again. Can you all hear me very well? For a second, I got a notification. Okay, just double checking. So I believe that I'll still wait for some questions in the Q&A box, but I actually have also some general questions that panelists can choose to answer. And also, if you want to ask each other any questions, please do go ahead. Here is the time. So I'll let you actually. Would you like to ask each other any questions? I'll defer to you as I've been talking too much. And if not, I'll continue. Okay. Oh, I have another one in the box. Okay, let me do this first then. A question for Julieta. Do you have any research about the barriers that exist for people within countries that have legislated, i.e., developed housing rights at a domestic level, as to why they may struggle to mobilize their housing rights? Well, yeah. Do we have research about the barriers that exist for people on why they may struggle to mobilize?
Yeah, so we've done quite a lot of research on what we call the financialization of housing. And unfortunately, while you may have legislated right to housing, and housing may be considered a human right under your legal system, it doesn't mean that it's not actually one of the world's most valuable assets and where a lot of the money is going into. So governments have a really hard decision, like they do, for example, with fossil fuels when trying to address climate change. Even though we know the right to a healthy environment is also a human right, they have to decide what's going to be best for their economy or what's going to be best for their people. And oftentimes they make the wrong decision. So what we're seeing is the financialization of housing is actually creating a massive barrier for people to be able to exercise their right to housing and to be able to enjoy their right to housing. And oftentimes what this lends to is a discriminatory practice where people who can't afford private housing, because it is financialized, the government feels that they also don't deserve private housing and that they have to be forced into some more a different type non-private housing. And it's not to say that we want more social housing, we want non-market housing, but oftentimes governments don't even believe that. So if you're living in homelessness, what you deserve is a shelter and not a home. So there's a lot of discriminatory practices that come with the fact that housing is the most valuable asset in the world at the moment. More valuable than gold, more valuable than stocks. It is the most valuable asset in the world. And that creates a real difficulty and barrier to exercising and enjoying your human right to housing.
Absolutely.
I would love to hear. And I would love to hear how the other panelists feel about that, if that's something that you're experiencing in your context as well.
Would anyone like to speak on that?
Yeah, in Prague, in all Czech Republic, the housing is now super expensive, and it's almost impossible to buy any new property for the middle class or the poor people. It's something absolutely insane. I think this is also our role to stress out this topic and try to do something we call decommodification of the houses in all Europe, I believe, right now, because there are many people from rich Arabian countries that are buying houses in Czech Republic or in Prague. Some of them own 150 flats, and if you have this like big investors that are not living in that area, it's really crazy because they use it just for Airbnb or booking purposes. And I believe that we need some space to solve the problem, and if the space is day by day smaller, it's something that is impossible then. Yeah, so it's quite a big problem in Czech Republic. It definitely needs some regulation.
Absolutely. I just will check the Q&A, and I currently don't see any more questions. Oh, every time I say that, a question comes in, so I can't tell. The audience is really reading my queue. Thank you, audience. So, what interventions are there in an unexpected event of a forced eviction? Is there reparation? So, what happens when someone is forcibly evicted, and what interventions are there when that happens? I can say that more generally to the panel, but
I mean, I think I can talk from the human rights framework. So, forced evictions are a prima facie violation of human rights. So, forced evictions are never allowed for any reason whatsoever. They are a violation not just of the right to housing, but of human rights writ large. So the problem is, again, that the international human rights framework isn't prescriptive to say when there is a forced eviction, this is the reparation that is owed or that communities are entitled to. It's for the domestic legal framework to be able to implement those details. That being said, we have found that there has been a lot of success, for example, when communities, and there's been a lot of failures, equal, I mean, if not probably more failures than successes. But when our global director was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, and I was supporting her as the senior aide, when communities would tell us that there was an impending forced eviction, we would raise the alarm. We would often send an urgent appeal to the government, try to talk to the government, make them understand that this is an egregious violation of human rights. There sometimes was a pause and a step back and an alternative course taken. And sometimes there wasn't. And obviously within the human rights world, there was a lot of naming and shaming of governments who embarked on forced evictions to show that this can't happen. Now, that was in 2019, 2018. The world is very different. And we know that naming and shaming, when it comes to egregious violations of human rights, including genocide, don't necessarily work anymore. So we're in a really difficult position around human rights and human rights enforcement. I don't think that means we give up. But it is a really, really tricky time to navigate as communities and as people who are human rights defenders. I wish I could give a more positive answer, but maybe Gugun or Maria Olga, you have more experiences on the ground.
yes, I am quite curious. Gugun, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree about the human rights in the international law, but sometimes it didn't work in the field. Yeah. That's so sad about that. In our case, our experience, we face many forced eviction. The first is we refuse to leave from the location. So communities stay with whatever condition. It's so bad condition, but we don't have another option except to stay and survive in a bad condition. Then also there is in Indonesia case, we have opportunity to go to the courts and sue the government about the eviction. But mostly we fail about that because the people always ask by the judge about their the land certificate, the land rights, and the informal settlement never have the certificate, so they mostly fail. But there is example that they won in the court because Indonesia system is not a common law, so every court have their own decision, and that's why political contract is a part of the way how to get the remedy for the community that evict before.
I think that kind of leads to a wider question in kind of the current situation. And I'm quite curious what it has been like to maintain these practices now once you've kind of secured legal change. Like, what are the current risks, and how have you maintained and kind of kept going to make sure that this legal precedent you set, again, just an entry point, has kind of continued to resist risks or provide precedent for other communities who are at risk of eviction? I don't know if Mariolga, Gugun, you have any thoughts on that? David as well, of course.
Sí, acá en Puerto Rico,
Here in
pues al
Puerto
igual que en el
Rico,
resto, ¿verdad?, del
just as
mundo,
in the rest of the world,
las presiones del mercado en relación a las
the market
propiedades y la
pressures
desregulación
for
en torno
deregulation and all
a lo que se
that
puede hacer o no con las propiedades, sobre todo con los
around
alquileres a
what
corto
can be
plazo, ha
done with
desestabilizado
the real property, particularly the short-term
la situación
rentals,
de
that
vivienda
has
en Puerto Rico,
destabilized the housing
tanto a
situation
nivel
in Puerto
de
Rico,
compra y venta de
both
propiedades como a
in the
nivel,
terms
¿verdad?,
of
de alquileres.
purchase
Así
and
que
sale
es
of
una situación
properties and also
compleja
of
la
the
que hay acá
rentals.
y hay
It's a
muy
complex
poca
situation
voluntad
here,
política
and
de
there's no
regularlo
political
en este
will
momento.
to
Al
regulate
contrario,
it
yo diría que hay
currently. On the contrary, I
bastante
would say
ambiente para seguir incentivando ese
there's
mercado
more
desregulado y
incentives
de
for
seguir
that
atrayendo
deregulated
inversionistas
market to
extranjeros
keep attracting
a seguir
foreign
comprando
investment,
carteras y carteras
to
de
keep
propiedades, que es
buying
lo que venimos
portfolios of
viendo de
properties.
la
This is
pandemia
what
para
we've
acá.
seen since the
En términos
pandemic,
de
actually.
los,
And then
¿verdad?, de los forced evictions,
in terms of the
en el
forced
caso del
evictions,
Caño, nosotros
in the
sí
Martin
tenemos
Caño,
que
in our
relocalizar
project,
familias
we
para
had to
poder llevar a
relocate
cabo los proyectos de
families in order to
infraestructura,
carry out the
el dragado del Caño
infrastructure
y demás.
projects, the
Nosotros nos
dredging of the
dejamos llevar por
channel,
una
and all
ley
that.
que
And
es,
we have a
lo
law,
voy a decir en inglés, sorry por el cambiar de idioma, el
and,
Urban
you know,
Relocation Act,
is the Urban
que
Relocation
básicamente
Act
establece los
that
derechos de los
basically
ocupantes
establishes
cuando
the
uno tiene que
rights
llevar a
of
cabo proyectos de
settlers
construcción.
when you
Es
have
una
to
ley
carry
de
out a
los Estados
construction
Unidos y que
project.
pues
It's a
por nuestra
US
relación
act,
colonial pues
and because of
podemos
our
aplicar
colonial
acá.
relationship, we can
Y
enforce it
es
here.
bajo el marco,
And
¿verdad?,
it's
de cómo
under
nosotros
the
llevamos a cabo realojos.
That's how
Que eso
we
pudiera ser una
do
sesión
the
en sí misma, un
relocations.
proceso en el cual incluye participación
It's a process
ciudadana,
that includes
incluye que
the
la persona va a
citizen
terminar con un hogar
participation.
decente,
The
seguro, sanitario y
person
saldo,
will have a
igual o
decent
mejor que el que
home
tenía,
at the
¿verdad?,
end,
en su
even
lugar de
in
origen,
better
pero eso es en el
conditions
caso
than
del
what they
Caño.
had in
En el
their
caso de Puerto
original
Rico, sí
location.
se
That's
ha
in our project.
creado
In Puerto Rico as a
una
whole, there's
conciencia
a
general de rechazo
more
a este
awareness
tipo de
now
adquisiciones
to
por la
reject
fuerza
this
y
kind
de
of
lanzamientos de las personas, y
forced
sí se genera movilización y activismo político
evictions and
cuando se
forced
dan esas
relocations of
circunstancias.
people. And when that
Ha habido un caso
happens,
muy
there's a
famoso en los
lot of
últimos
movement.
años de
There
una
was a
señora en
famous case
Aguadilla, que su
recently of a
familia,
woman
Aguadilla es un pueblo en el
in
oeste, un pueblo
Aguadilla, that is
costero
a town,
hermoso,
a
es un
coastal
lugar
town on the west.
espectacular, es
It's
una
a
playa espectacular acá
beautiful
en Puerto
place, a
Rico, y
beautiful
ahí esta
beach
señora
here
que su
in Puerto
familia ha
Rico. And
ocupado el
this
espacio por más de 150 50 años
woman had
y la
been there for
quieren
150
sacar.
years,
Y ha
her
habido grandes
family, of course,
movilizaciones.
and she
Así que
wanted
acá
to be
sí hay una
relocated, and there
conciencia
was a massive
un poco
movement
separo,
against
¿verdad? La
that.
experiencia del caño de la experiencia
So
nacional. En el caño lo
this is
manejamos de una forma muy
in our
particular
local
dentro de un
project,
marco
we
legal
manage
con unos
that in a
reglamentos muy
particular
específicos,
way
con
with a very
participación del
specific
liderato comunitario en
regulations,
cómo se
with
va
participation of
haciendo.
the community
Y
leaders.
en el resto de Puerto Rico
And
no
in
hay
the rest of the country, we
no
don't have
necesariamente se siguen esos mismos
that
protocolos porque esa es la realidad, pero
same
sí hay una
protocol,
conciencia
because
tanto de la
that's the
gente sobre
reality,
sus
but there is
derechos y de cómo
awareness
no permitir que
among
se les saque
people
de los
about their
lugares,
rights and about
como
how not to allow for them
de
to
los
be
movimientos
taken
políticos y
out of
sociales de
their
reaccionar y
place.
apoyar a
So
quienes
there's a
están
lot of
viviendo ese tipo de
reaction to
procesos.
support those
Lo que
people that
sí no
are suffering those
necesariamente hay
processes.
y que sí
But
nosotros tratamos de
what
trabajarlo acá en las
we
comunidades
don't
del
have
caño es
necessarily, but
la
we're trying to work on here
conciencia,
in our
y ante la
community,
estrechez
is
económica es
awareness.
complicado pedirle a la gente que tenga
We
conciencia,
know,
¿verdad? A nivel
given the
individual, eso
economic
siempre hay que tenerlo en cuenta. Las
situation,
situaciones
it's
materiales de las
difficult
personas les
to
van a llevar
ask
a tomar
people
decisiones y acciones que desde afuera
to
es fácil
make
decirle, mira, oye,
decisions
no haga
when
esto.
they
Pero
affect
acá
their
nos falta
income.
todavía
It's
desarrollar
difficult,
más
but
conciencia
here we still
sobre los
have to
procesos de
develop more
especulación en sí
awareness
mismos.
about the speculation
Desde el huracán
processes
María en el
themselves. Since
2017,
Hurricane Maria in
Puerto Rico ha
2017,
vivido
Puerto
procesos
Rico
masivos de
has
migración y hemos perdido mucha
experienced
población.
massive
Así que tenemos
migrations. We've
muchas
lost a
propiedades
lot of
abandonadas.
population. So there's
Entonces,
a
de
lot of
repente,
abandoned
a veces, cuando tú
properties.
tienes el problema de una
So
propiedad abandonada
sometimes
al
when you
lado
have the
tuyo y eso
problem
te
of a
genera
property
problemas
that
de
is abandoned
seguridad,
next to you, and that
de
creates security
salud, por
issues, health
sabandija y
issues,
demás, puedes tender a pensar que qué bueno que
you tend
compraron
to
esa
think
casa
that,
o qué
well,
bueno que
it's
compraron
great
ese
that this
edificio porque se
house
van a
was
hacer
bought,
cargo
or that this
del
building
problema.
was
Entonces,
bought, because
creo
now
que
they're
ahí
going
a
to
nivel
solve our
nacional tenemos que
problems. So
todavía
at a national
mucho
level,
terreno y
we
mucho
still
trabajo para
have
cómo generamos
to
esa
do a lot
conciencia
of work
sobre cómo
to
se van
raise
llevando a cabo esos
awareness
procesos
about
especulativos,
how those
porque tal vez
speculation
cuando
processes are
en una
carried out.
comunidad, en un
Because
área, te
perhaps
dicen, ah, qué
in a
bueno que compraron
community, they
esas
tell
5
you,
casas
well,
porque
it's
ya no
great
van a
they
ser un
bought
problema para los
these five
demás, pues
houses
les
that will no
alegra que hayan
longer be a
comprado esas
problem
casas.
for us.
Pero
They're
cuando
happy
se
for
tranca
that.
el acceso a
But
la
then,
playa o un bien
when they have
común,
no
acá se
longer
valora
access
mucho,
to the
¿verdad? Los elementos de
beach,
la naturaleza que tenemos.
uh,
Entonces
here we
ahí la
value
gente
nature
reacciona.
a
Así que
lot.
creo que
That is
todavía a
where
nivel de
people
movimientos
react.
sociales
So
tenemos que lograr
at still
esas
at the level of
interseccionalidades para
social
generar más
movements,
conciencia y más
we have
activismo
to
al
raise more
respecto.
awareness and more activism.
I think that's an excellent place for us to stop. And I'm sorry, I know there's a couple of remaining questions, but I do want to wrap up on time today. So I don't know if the panelists see those questions in the Q&A and can answer them. Please do feel free. I don't know if anyone wants on the panel to say any final remarks before I kind of wrap up some of the discussion today, but if you would like to, please go ahead. You can unmute now.
I'd just like to say, just shine a little bit of a light on World Habitat, not to make you uncomfortable, Abby, but I think World Habitat does such an amazing job at showing the power that communities have to realize the right to housing in particular. And it's just, you create such an amazing space for knowledge exchange. And I just would like to thank you for that. We rely on it a lot in our work.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take that as encouragement to keep going with our housing insight sessions. I really enjoyed this discussion today, and it's been such a pleasure to hear more about all of the panelists' work and to hear your insight, Julieta, as well. I think kind of some of the things I was thinking about from the conversation today is, you know, our discussion about how no legal tool works on its own. We were really thinking about, when I was even thinking and talking about these questions, it's kind of being like one legal tool has done this, and it's very clear that it's actually not just on its own. It's very much how it exists within the housing context with the community and how crucial they are as a backing to it to help drive that momentum for accountability for housing rights. I also thought it was so interesting to hear how these tools take time and they take resistance, hearing how Mariolga described years of these kind of this really challenging work to kind of to tackle former colonial, current colonial, and ideological attacks, as well as also, David, listening to 13 years of developing this Housing Act is just truly, truly remarkable. So the years that this take is really admirable. And then finally, I do want to speak to also the fact that these levels are all meant to work together and not in isolation. I thought, Julieta, that was really clear that there's no real border between international human rights as well as, you know, the trust that we've heard about tonight, the statutes we've heard about tonight, and the national housing legislation. So it's fantastic to kind of hear that none of these are really in isolation. And to be honest, that speaks more to also why we create these spaces, these knowledge sharing spaces, because of the idea that there are many different parts of this, but it is all helping to contribute to tackling the housing crisis and helping communities do that. So on that note, I'm going to thank everyone for joining today. Thank you to every single one of our panelists. That was really, really insightful and very interesting. And I would also encourage people again, if you would like to provide feedback for this session, please feel free to send an email to World Habitat at wha@worldhabitat.org, because we want to hear your feedback. We want to keep refining these sessions and how we design them. And then also I know it's early, but look out for the World Habitat Awards call for entries in January, everyone. If you have any friends, Mario, got any of those CLTs who are working on the environment side, of course, we would love to hear them. So just keep apprised, and you can also sign up for our newsletter for any updates or new sessions ahead. But I just want to thank you all very much today. It was an excellent session. Goodbye to our panelists as well.
Thanks, everyone.